Yeehaw. In case any of you are wondering about this effort, about a year ago, a year and 2 weeks, I had a stroke. I know I'm impossibly young to have had such a thing, but there it is. So about a year ago this week, I was moving around in a Hoyer lift, which is sort of like what the stork brings the babies in, except people my size. And over the past year, I've graduated from going around in a bag to going around in a walker to going around with a cane, quad cane, and now a single point cane. Okay, now let's see how this works. It's a family heirloom. It belonged to my mother's father, who brought it back from France in 1919, because he needed it to get around after being in France in 1918. Okay. A lot of buttons on this thing.
Help is on the way.
Okay.
That one's forward, that one's backwards.
Ah. Okay, there we go. Discovering Eifelheim. Eifelheim is the name of the book. I wrote an article for a collection made by King's College in London on medieval science fiction, which addressed the question of whether there was science fiction in the Middle Ages, or can you set science fiction in the Middle Ages? You'll be totally shocked to learn that the answer was yes on both accounts. It's a medieval epic, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, in which Sir John sets forth to discover new life and new civilizations, and encounters alien creatures like Blemier and Sheopods and what have you. Don't worry, we'll see them later. And because it's hard science fiction, he uses an astrolabe to take positions on the pole star to prove that the Earth is a sphere, which apparently is very well known in the Middle Ages. I don't know where that came up that the Earth was flat. I think Washington Irving made that up. Okay. So, skipping over a bunch of stuff about science and fiction in the Middle Ages, which if you find this book, which is heavy reading, and I mean that literally, it's a pretty heavy book. I discovered Eifelheim twice. First time I wasn't looking. Just found it under a rock. But the first time, what happened there?
Go back to the slide.
Ah, okay. It's hard to tell when all the slides are behind me. Ah, I can see it. Way back in history, when I was first setting out in the game, I discovered that, and it's an interesting thing, I discovered that people would actually pay me for writing these stories. I said, why didn't they let me in on this sooner? Because I've been writing these stories since I was a little kid. Oh, well. Anyhow, I was noodling around with the idea of writing a story of first contact with aliens from another planet, and I didn't want to do it the usual way, the normal way. So I decided that I would have it happen a couple hundred years ago in the Middle Ages. Okay. Then to make that happen, did that work? Nope. There we go. There were 3 seeds. I wanted a story which was sort of like an intellectual adventure. 2 people in the modern age, or actually near future, one a theoretical physicist, so they would be used to like fantastic stuff, and the other one a cleologist. Now, cleology was a name I made up for mathematical history. And I got that largely from reading about Kristallers' central place theory, about how settlements, villages are spaced and their distances from one another, and Nicholas Reshevsky's book, Looking at History Through Mathematics. I also read an article that put settlements, expressed settlement patterns in terms of a pair of partial differential equations. I thought, that is way cool. So I wanted to write a science fiction story in which the science was history. Okay, so far so good. Then thirdly, I read a newspaper article about some soldiers on maneuvers in Germany who had come across a grave where the stone was covered with carvings of like bats and spiders and skulls and what have you. And the soldiers decided that this was Dracula's grave. Nowhere near Dracula's country, but it's in, I think, Bavaria. And I thought, now, okay, what if something is buried there? Now, I don't write horror, so it wasn't going to be Dracula. You can put that out of your mind right away. So it was going to be an alien who came to Earth in the Middle Ages and died there and was buried there. Okay. Why doesn't anybody know about that? Why wasn't it in all the papers? Ooh, too far. No, that was right. Maybe I'm going to have to turn my back to the audience. If you have a settlement, see, villages are placed on the landscape. Every point on the landscape has a function called affinity. For example, there might be gold there, gold mine, or good fishing in the river. Or like Rome, it's the lowest point on the Tiber River that could be spanned by a bridge buildable by the technology of that era. So every place has an affinity, something that attracts people. Let's call it gravity, just to sort of keep a physics approach. And as you get farther away from that settlement, the influence of the settlement dies off with an inverse square. And we know that because the guy wrote a paper, I can't think who it was, because it's down in my basement and they won't allow me to climb the steps. Well, I'm getting back there. Anyhow, in the paper, the author took the known political boundaries of Aztec-era settlements in Mexico and calculated, based on those boundaries and distance from the center, what the relationship was. And he found off that the influence died off with an inverse 1.99. And I wanted to slap him across the face because he wouldn't say, okay, 2. I guess he was afraid of being accused of slavish imitation of physics. Okay, so inverse square, well, that makes sense, because as you go out from the village, the amount of area being influenced increases with the square of the distance. So the influence gets diluted by inverse square. So far, so good. If affinity were the only thing affecting settlements, then everybody would be sucked into the village like a black hole. But there's another force at work, and that is population pressure itself. All things being equal, people would rather not have somebody else's elbow in their ear. And so as the population gets greater, people start to move out. Greek city-states regularly sent out pods of people to build other cities somewhere else, the Greek colonies. They wound up everywhere. They wound up in the Crimea, and Marseille, not Marseille, it's a song. Marseille, okay. All along the coast of Ionia and so forth. If that were the only force in operation, the population was spread out evenly across the landscape in a sort of cultural heat death. So you got these two forces, affinity drawing people into the place and population pressure driving them away. The balance between the two are those pair of differential equations I told you about, a diffusion reaction system. And I thought, that's sort of like stars. Gravity sucking all these gases together until they ignite, and then radiation pressure spreading it out. Cool. New York must have been a supernova. I tried it out one time. I took the relative populations of New York City and Philadelphia. You may have heard of Philadelphia. It's another city on the East Coast. And I figured, using inverse square, how far along I-95 would you get before the influence of New York became less than the influence of Philadelphia? Another way of looking at it is, when do the Yankee fans disappear and the Phillies fans begin to appear? Trenton. And the thing that makes that interesting is that there's a line dividing New Jersey in half. There used to be two colonies, East Jersey, which is in the north, and West Jersey, which is in the south. It's New Jersey. And they have different laws. The real estate laws are different. They have different names for instruments and so forth. So there really is a cultural divide running slash-wise through the state of New Jersey. So it worked. Inverse square. Whoa. Thank you, thank you. Okay. Now, how do I start it again? Okay, there we go. This is the Christaller central place theory that says, in terms of marketing, if you're in a village growing your wheat or barley or whatever, how far are you going to go to take it to market? So market towns tend to be in the center of hexagons, well, actually circles, but they get messy, so we use hexagons. The center of hexagons, surrounded generally by 6 villages, unless there's a mountain or a lake or something else. And you make the simplifying assumption of an infinite smooth plane, which all the physicists are sitting there nodding, okay. Because physicists do that all the time. Perfectly elastic collisions, infinite Euclidean space, all that stuff. Nobody's ever actually run into anything like that, but what the heck. So the people who do this kind of thing, they usually say the diameter of the hexagons is actually the time and effort required to travel that distance. So 5 miles uphill and 5 miles flat ground, two different things. But what the heck? And each of these market towns tend to cluster around a large city. Large being somewhat flexible in its definition. Philadelphia would be a large city. Bleh. Okay. Two other grids that Christaller looked at were based on transportation. You do tend to get settlements halfway between two other settlements because people stop and rest. There are a bunch of boroughs, not the donkeys, I mean little townlets, those kind of boroughs, around where I grew up that make no sense. Why are they there? You know, these little townlets, little boroughs. And the reason is simple, that back in the day when transportation meant a canal barge pulled by two donkeys, two actual burros, that's about as far as you could go before passengers had to get off and stretch their legs. And so all along the Delaware River, you had these little towns, pretty much evenly spaced, to accommodate these canal barges. Almost said canal boats. They weren't boats. Okay. So that was the second impulse. The first one was I wanted to write a certain kind of story. This was the idea as a what if one of those villages was missing? And there was no good reason for it. There's a lot of towns in Colorado where the villages are missing because the gold or silver ran out. And then everybody left. Goodbye, so long. But what if you could come up with no reason whatsoever why that village was not there? So I had it there. It disappeared during the Black Death, was never resettled, unlike other villages nearby. Not even a new village in the same hexagon. So this puzzled my cleologist because it was an anomaly, and he had to come up with an explanation. So that was the scientific problem. And then there was that grave. So I invented a new grave with a strange, weird face on it, discovered in the Black Forest. Not Bavaria. Bavaria is too civilized. Black Forest is where you want to go for weird stuff. Okay? And that was the novella. It was, like I said, it was an intellectual puzzle adventure, the capstone of which was a medieval illuminated manuscript that turned out to be a circuit diagram. And revealed something about the aliens, that there were aliens, because circuit diagrams are not that common in the Middle Ages. And then finally they went to the place and they exhumed the grave and found something very, very weird. The last thing, which was not a seed to the story, but was a consequence of trying to write it, was how come nobody knew these aliens were there? Well, okay, we've got to put it in a remote area. Black Forest takes care of that. And they didn't use a spaceship. That would draw a lot of attention. So they came there by other bus, some sort of vehicle that traveled through hidden dimensions. And at the time, the sexy topic was Kaluza-Klein dimensions, which were rolled up real tight inside dimensions. And one of the documents they unearthed talked about a semi-heretical sect that preached about a trinity of trinities and ascribed it to St. Johann of Oberhochwald. Okay? And this is a schematic of it. Some of you may recognize what that would make people think of in the Middle Ages. I wonder, is there a pointer on this? The top, oh. Top button, not bottom, okay. Forget about it. Anyhow, the Trinity of Trinities, see 3 spatial dimensions indicated at each apex of the big triangle, and those are 9 dimensions. And then there are 3 time-like dimensions connecting the triangles, T time and tau time, and some mysterious third kind of time that nobody knows what it is. Now, we don't have to get into all that detail in writing the story. That was just to have some sort of hand-wavium or balonium drive to get the aliens to Oberhochwald without drawing a lot of attention from people in Freiburg or Stuttgart or any place nearby. See, God the Father, T is a mapping of the past onto the future. Tau goes somewhere else, maybe it's quantum. But one procession is the intellect, the other procession is the will. The subject is the Father in both cases, and the object is, in the first case, the Word, because what's the product of the intellect? It's conception, and conception is expressed in words. And the other one is the will goes forth and brings in the desired object, okay? And then what the heck, let's connect the other 2. I'm sorry if that makes any Orthodox angry with me. So we don't get into all that. My buddy back in graduate school, Mohsen Janatpour, was going to be a cosmologist. We were both in the math department at the time. And that's what we came up with. So we called it Janatpour space, because I didn't want to get blamed for it. Okay. So much for the novella. What's that say?
Journals, letters.
Okay, yeah, that's what they things that they found, journals, letters, old stuff, including that circuit diagram. Okay. Then, after a while, I got myself an agent. I didn't get an agent the usual way. I didn't call agents up and say, hey, you want to represent me? The agents called me. I thought, cool. That makes it easy. And Eleanor Wood, the keen and crafty Eleanor Wood, as I like to call her, had been Heinlein's agent after Blassingame died. So I was quite happy that she had said, hey, come on, I want to represent you. Want to write a novel? I said, okay. Said, how about if you write the novel about Eifelheim? I said, oh, come on. All I have to do is say Eifelheim and my brothers fall asleep. Because the novella, like I said, is just like an intellectual talking heads kind of thing. And she said, no, write the novel of what happened in the Middle Ages. I said, didn't Connie Willis just write a novel about Middle Ages there? The Doomsday Book, which is very good. So I was reluctant to sort of go back to that well so quickly. So I wrote a different novel. And one thing led to another. A couple years later, I said, okay, let's write Eifelheim. And I said, okay. And she said, it'll make you a lot of money. I said, okay. It's about an encounter between two people, one very strange and alien, and the other pretty much like us. The gimmick is the alien giant grasshoppers are pretty much like us, and the medieval Germans are strange and alien. I have only one word for you: Thomism. This is the artwork that appeared actually in analog in the first novella. Nick Janeshig is a very, very good artist. And I think the great thing about a lot of science fiction art is that it's intense realism dealing with incredibly weird subject matter. How he managed to get a grasshopper staring out the window with a wistful look on his face, I have no idea, but I certainly do get that impression. Old Johann, who was called Johann von Sterne, is not the only one shipwrecked. There's a whole ship full of grasshoppers. So I was looking around for a place to put this, because I didn't need it for a novella, but now I was going to write a novel set in the place. I had to figure out, where the heck is this place? This is not the map I used. There was no such thing as Google Maps at the time. It was actually a paper map. Let me explain about paper maps. Never mind. And I looked it over and I said, there's an empty area in there where there are no villages indicated, which was the case on the original map too. So I picked that location. You can actually go to where Eifelheim was supposed to be if you follow this map. Of course, if you do that, you'll probably die in the wilderness. At one end, if you draw a line from Oberried to Barenthal, which is Bear Valley, and you draw another line from St. Wilhelm or St. Willie's to Hirschsprung, which is Stag's Leap, which is on the edge of something called Hell Valley, the Holmtal. That's where you find the manor. I didn't draw that. I drew something from which an artist actually drew that. But that's a typical medieval manor. There's Stag's Leap. It was called that because a hunter chasing a stag, the stag came to the edge of the gorge and leaped over the gorge in one leap. It's hard to leap over a gorge in two leaps. But thing to keep in mind is the gorge was actually narrower back in the day. They widened it when they built a highway through it. There's Hell Valley. Now you got to admit that a village that accumulates legends about flying demons, having Hell Valley right nearby was very portentous. I said, cool, Hell Valley, you can't ask for a better nomenclature than that. I forgot it was a Black Forest, and you have devil's pulpits in Hell Valley and probably more ghoulies and ghostlies and goblins per square inch than any other place on the face of the earth. Of course, the highway wasn't there in the Middle Ages, neither were the cars or the railroad. The brook was there. Guess what that's called? Hell Brook, Holenbach. Nobody was able to put a road through there until the Austrians built a road so that Marie Antoinette could travel to France and meet her fiancé. So traveling through that valley was really bad luck. In one of the interminable wars, the revolution, Marshal Villars said that he had no intention of marching his army up that valley. He didn't want to go near the devil. Okay. The Feldberg demon was a flying demon. I didn't know that when I started writing the darn thing. It just was luck. But like I said, if you're in the Black Forest, you're going to run into a ghoul or a ghost or a sprite or a water nixie or something. That's just the way it was. Okay. Something else that is in Hell Valley is a place called Falcon Rock, or Falkenstein. That's it right there. The robber baron von Falkenstein, which sounds like it ought to be a movie with Gene Wilder and his crew, von Falkenstein, yeah. But he really was a robber baron, and his castle was sacked about 40 years after the time frame of the book. Well, I couldn't stand that, so I moved it up 40 years and had it happen during the course of the book. Cool. Because that way the alien Kranken could use high explosives to help sack it. As you can see, otherwise it would have been fairly difficult. That's one steep rock. But it really was sacked by the Freiburger militias. Every guild had its own armed party. And they got really, really hunked off finally at the robber baron exacting tolls on all the commerce. And there's a romantic story about a guy who was kidnapped by von Falkenstein to hold for ransom, and his girlfriend went there to the base of the hill and said, "Send me back my fiancé." And von Falkenstein says, "Then you shall have him," and threw him off the cliff. Right there in front of her. And she said, "You'll be sorry." And she went back to Freiburg and roused up the guilds. They assembled their militias, and they went out declaring their right to bear arms. Go figure. Okay. There's a lot of stuff that was happening in that time and place. Now, here's the thing. If you write a science fiction story, or even any kind of story, set in the past, you can't make it up. If you set it in the future, and I have written several science fiction stories set in the future, some of them set thousands of years in the future, you can make that up. I don't care what you're saying. So, well, okay, they travel between stars using superluminal Krasnikov tubes of folded space. And who's going to say, nah? Instead, you will say, cool. That way, it takes only days or weeks to travel between stars. Otherwise, it might take longer. You'd have to go across what they call the Newtonian flats. Much slower. Okay, but I digress. If you set the story in the past, it behooves you to find out what the heck was happening in the past. so you don't say something stupid. Now, you will say something stupid at some point, depend on it, and one of your readers will write you a letter and point that out. It's just one of the rules of the game. But I did study up on what was going on in the early to mid 1300s. For example, there's a big struggle on the German chessboard between the three big houses of Wittelsbach, Habsburg, and Luxembourg. And for a while, people were sort of afraid that Luxembourg would conquer Europe. Actually, they're still around, and the others have gone. Wittelsbachs were kings of Bavaria for a while, but they sort of gave that up after World War I. Same thing with the Habsburgs, who also had a good thing going. Somebody pointed out that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was less a state than it was a marriage dowry, because the Habsburgs got all that stuff by marrying well. There was also, just before the start of this book, the Barons' War, where several of the local barons were trying to seize the town of Freiburg. One of the things about being a valuable plum is that if somebody wants to grab you, there are a couple other guys that will stop them. So the barons are fighting each other to prevent each other from taking Freiburg. Freiburg came out of it pretty well. It became an imperial free city, which sounds sort of weird, but that's what they called it. There were several of these imperial free cities in the Upper Rhine, and they even had a little league of their own called the League of Imperial Free Cities. Okay, Freiburg was one of them. How do I know Freiburg was a free city? It's Freiburg. Freeburg. It didn't mean that the McDonald's was costing nothing. Okay. The Franciscans, wait a minute, do we have a Franciscan here? Okay. They were having a big controversy between two factions called the spirituals and the conventuals. The conventuals wanted to live in monasteries and convents, just like Dominicans or one of those other gangs. The spirituals wanted to live a life of poverty out among the people, owning nothing, going from town to town begging, just like Francis. If you ever saw the movie The Name of the Rose, you see some of that, not all of that. And it sort of got them in trouble, and the general of the Franciscan order and his buddies had to flee Avignon, and they took refuge in the empire where Wittelsbach, Ludwig der Bayer, was the emperor, and he wanted a chance to stick it in the Pope's eye, and so he gave shelter, protection to the Franciscans. The conventuals stayed where they were and said, we don't know them. We don't know these guys. And so they prospered. One of the Franciscans that fled with Michael was named William from the town of Occam. He was clean shaven, as most of you could probably figure out, because he had a razor of surpassing fineness. You like that? I was glad I could work that in. Okay. By the way, Occam's razor was not ontological, it was epistemological. and translated into modern language, if you read what he wrote, translated into modern language, it said, don't have too many variables in your model or you won't understand your own model. Or as a friend of mine put it, if you have 7 variables in your model, you can model any set of data in the world. Just have to be able to pick the coefficients. You can fit any data. The big scandal of the day was the scandal of Margaret Maltosh, also known as Maggie Pocketmouth, or sometimes Baggy Mouth. The reason why she was a scandal is she had been married to Henry of Luxembourg. She was the Duchess of Tyrol, and that gave Luxembourg control of the Tyrol. And as they put it, she found Henry to be both stupid and impotent. And while she could tolerate one or the other, she could not tolerate both. And so she got a divorce. But this was a scandal, because she got the divorce from the emperor. Emperors were not allowed to grant divorces. Had to get it from the Pope. The Pope and the emperor were at odds, so she just did it. And she married, as I recollect, a Habsburg. That gave Habsburg control of the Tyrol, and it remained in Habsburg hands until World War I, excuse me. Except for the southern Tyrol, which wound up in Italian hands somehow. Her likeness has come down to us in Alice in Wonderland as the Queen of Hearts. The short little queen with the big face and the sagging jowls, off with her head. Probably she wasn't like that. She was probably as good looking as anybody else, and her enemies would set that about, that she was ugly and therefore blah, blah, blah. That's why she was also known as the Ugly Duchess of Tyrol. Every age has these things going on. Scandals and political intrigue and stuff like that. All this gives the characters in the novel something to talk about that will actually make sense. The Benfield Conference and the Flagellate procession took place during the Black Death. The Flagellate procession actually occurred, they reached Strasbourg a couple months after the conclusion of the book. So I moved it up a couple months. You're allowed to do that when you write a book, as long as, in my opinion, as long as you say you did it. People don't think you made a mistake. They know you did it on purpose. The Benfield Conference was a summoning of all the lords of the Alsace to decide what to do about the Jews. Because we got this plague going on. It spread so rapidly from country to country. What do we know of that moves from country to country? Jews. Tell you the truth, the flagellants had a better idea. If you're going to beat up on anybody, you might as well be yourself. Well, they didn't know what else to do. Well, the scientists did. You could ring the church bells. What would that do? The Black Death was a malady, malodor, bad air. So this mass of stiffened air released by an earthquake in central Italy, I'm not making this up, was floating around from country to country, blown by the winds. If you rang the church bells, the sound waves might break up the bad air. They had sound scientific reasons for believing this. Now, the fact that they were totally helpless in the face of this plague doesn't mean they weren't trying their darndest to figure things out. The Pope's physician, Guy de Chauliac, thought it might have something to do with rats. Oh, well. I ran across a website, the link is now broken, that gave the year and the month in which the Black Death appeared in different towns and cities. And I used that to figure out when the plague would reach Oberhochwald. That was really great. It enabled me to pace the story a certain way. And they would hear the plague coming because they would hear the church bells ringing from far away and then from closer. Okay. This is Pastor Dietrich. And in order to have him interact with the aliens, he had to be an educated man. University of Paris trained. His instructor was Jean Buridan de Bethune, and whose grand instructor, Bethune's instructor, was William of Ockham. And so he learned all about Aristotelian physics and all that other kind of neat stuff. And so he's not hopelessly dumbfounded, gobsmacked by these aliens and their technology. He finds ways to communicate with them. So what's he doing out in the hick backcountry in Oberhochwald? And the answer is, about 20 years before the start of the novel, there was a peasant uprising in the Rhineland called the Armleder. And the peasants would go around sacking manor houses and hanging rich people, which actually sounds like a pretty good idea, but didn't work out so well because eventually the portcullises went up on the castles and the knights would come galloping out and trample them into a bloody mush. Oh well. The reason the castles and cities eventually conquered the countryside was that they were hotbeds of disease anyway. And so the knights would come forth and conquer the countryside with a few well-placed sneezes. There we go. There's Hans. So instead of an invading fleet of monsters, as you often get in Hollywood movies, I figured they're going to be stranded travelers. The vessel that they were in is a charter bus, chartered by a bunch of scientists to go somewhere else, and it broke down along the way, had to land here. Also on the bus was a group of travelers, a group of tourists who were intending to go somewhere else also. The way tourist was translated in the Middle Ages was pilgrim. Pilgrims would go from shrine to shrine, and in each shrine they would get a badge that said, I went to Canterbury and all I got was this lousy badge. Oh well. So they are a mixed crew. I also decided that the Krinken would be like humans. There would be multiple races and ethnicities among them. And they didn't always get along with one another. And that they had broken into factions. What should we do? What should we do? Some said, let's conquer this village and wipe them out and take over. And some said, no, let's just try to live with them. And others said, let's try to fix the ship, for crying out loud. And they said, we don't have Scotty with us. How can you fix a starship without Scotty? Oh, well. Their ancestors, evolutionarily speaking, were sort of kind of like insects. So they have a very case-driven society. They have free will, so they're not determined by this instinct they have. But, like, if you're not paying attention and somebody superior says to you, tote that barge, you hop right to it. But if you think about it, maybe you say, no way. I ain't doing that. And especially now that we're shipwrecked, you're not really in authority over me anymore. The captain is dead, and the first officer is a schmuck. So the Krenken society is sort of breaking up under the influence of this tragedy. Also, good news, they are immune to the plague. The plague bacillus has no traction on their molecules. Unfortunately, every good deed goes punished. They are also lacking in at least one amino acid. Well, so are we. We get it through our food, so do they. But it's not anything that's in our food. So once their food runs out, they begin to die off from the lack of this nutrient. Oh, spoiler alert. Nobody's going to want to buy those books now. They know everything's going to happen. So they are lacking in an essential amino acid until at one point the ship's doctor figures out there is another source of this amino acid. They can go all Donner Party. And so he actually kills himself and leaves a sign on his body that says, "This is my body, eat me." The Germans, well, he must have died a Christian because they knew that formula. And he must have been taken by it. Although suicide, okay. And that raises the thing that happens throughout. Where'd that come from? That happens throughout, which is what we have here is a failure to communicate. And they'll say the same thing, the Krenken and the Germans, but they'll have different pictures in their heads about what they're saying. So even though Pastor Dietrich there is trying to fit the alien science into Aristotelianism, it doesn't fit too well, but it fits better than you might think. Sometimes they're just not talking the same thing. Now, how would medievals react to weird-looking critters? Well, they were used to the idea. There were weird-looking critters somewhere. They read about it from the ancients, Pliny, in his natural history encyclopedia. So they knew that there were these critters out there somewhere, and they might run into them, because unlike other stars, other parts of the earth were easily, well, not easily, they were at least accessible. The guy on the left is a sheopod, 1 foot. Now, from an evolutionary advantage point of view, that does not recommend itself. What if you stubbed your toe? how could you hop up and down on 1 foot if 1 foot was all you had to start with? However, the word on them was that if you lay on your back, you'd use your one giant foot to shade yourself. And that's why they figured these people lived in India, because in the medieval world, India was like really far away. It wasn't well traveled, it didn't get there very often. They actually got to China more easily than to India, largely because the Muslim world was in the way. They couldn't get through that. When they finally did get to India and they said, "Where are all the Shivapads?" The Indians said, "We heard about them. We thought they were over where you came from." So everybody has these weird critters and they always live somewhere else. The Cyclops speaks for itself. The hermaphrodites, midget hermaphrodites no less. And my personal favorite, the Bleme, with their faces on their torsos, no heads. On the far right is one of the medieval world's favorite wild critters, the doghead, also reputed to live out somewhere near India, although in one account, they live up in Scandinavia. And they were thought to be communicate by barks rather than real language. Was it conceptual language, or who was talking about that earlier today? Anyhow, maybe they aren't, maybe they are human. The St. Augustine, who you can always be dependent on, wrote in the City of God about these so-called monstrous races that you didn't have to believe they existed. Because come on, guys, Bleme, anybody ever see one? No. Saw a midget once, and Augustine saw a hermaphrodite once over in Alexandria. But they say you don't have to believe these races exist, but if they do, they're human, because they are rational animals. Maybe not dogheads if all they do is bark, but if they have language, they have reason, then they're humans. What does it mean to be human? Fits into the topic of this symposium. Oh, there's John again. Apparently, somebody on the internet was so taken by the story that he felt compelled to draw some art. So I stole it. Okay, I gave credit. So that brings up the question of what does it mean to be human? There are biological humans and metaphysical humans. Biologically, we're all familiar with that. Metaphysically, those are the rational animals, may or may not be biologically human. In fact, even some biological humans may not be metaphysically humans. At what point was the faculty of reason given to the ape men of the grasslands? That doesn't leave a fossil record. Only the bones do. So we know about biological human evolution, but the metaphysical aspect, that's how you can have a population of no less than 10,000 human beings, and yet there are still only Adam and Eve. There's only 2 of them among those 10,000. The others all look the same, but they don't have the rational faculties. They have imagination, but not intellect. There's a thought. Okay. Now, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? Well, they settled that in the Middle Ages because St. Christopher the Doghead was baptized. Naturally, this happened in Ireland. Quite possibly after a few drinks. He had spent his whole life eating human beings because, man, he's a carnivore. It's what we do. And then one day, contemplating, he realized what a horrible thing he was doing and converted. And according to legend, at the moment of his baptism, he became human, which is an interesting thing to say. Certainly it was an interesting thing for medieval to say. So there you have them, even preserved in medieval art. Medieval art does not mean King Arthur, who was medieval and named art, but that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, what did I just do? Well, if we don't stereotype the aliens, why should we stereotype the German peasants? Some of you are saying that those are Russian peasants. Well, yeah, okay, or Polish, Eastern European. You can tell by their clothing. But it shows a lot of variety there. So there's going to be some people in the village who do react the way people would if aliens were to land here today, running around screaming and waving their hands in the air. But then there were others, or would be others, who would say, it's sort of like dog heads, right? They're just grasshopper heads, or something like that. And they would be interested. Pastor Dietrich is one of them. Initially terrified, frozen in place, he can't move, he's paralyzed, and he's just is watching these creatures and realizes that they're in distress, they're injured. And right away, well, they can't be demons then, right? And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. When I started writing the story, I had some of the same mythological beliefs that modern rational people have about the Middle Ages. The world was flat. No, it wasn't. They knew that. I think Aquinas' second question in the Summa Theologica deals with the roundness of the earth. Not that he's trying to prove it. He simply expects that it's true and everybody else will agree with him. Because the point that he's trying to make is that you can study theology both from Scripture, from Revelation, and from philosophy. Two approaches to the same truth. And as an illustrative example, he gives the roundness, the sphericity of the earth as something that is known in two different ways. By the mathematician, by which we mean astronomer, or by the physicist. They both reach the same conclusion, but they do it by different methods. Okay. There's also that hoary old chestnut about, in the Middle Ages, they believed women had no souls. Obviously never heard Motown. And even a moment's thought dispenses with that. They really, really believed that the Blessed Virgin Mary had no soul, that the BVM was some sort of zombie. Come on, that doesn't hold water for even an instant. Third is that the serfs were no better than slaves. We'll speak about that in a moment. And that they were all governed by superstition, by which they meant Catholicism. And they were awkward and clumsy in the arts, sort of like Notre Dame Cathedral. Regine Pernod wrote a book, Those Terrible Middle Ages, in which she mentioned a conference that was held in Paris with the theme, Were the Middle Ages Civilized? And she said the participants, to reach the conference center, had to walk past Notre Dame. And she hoped that at least some of them would be niggled by some little doubt about the theme of the conference. Somebody built that cathedral. Oh well. Many of the characters in the story are going to be peasants in the village. They're also serfs, and the thing to remember is they're not the same thing. The serfs work for the Lord. The peasants live on land that the Lord has granted them the use of it. But otherwise, it's their land. They're free peasants. The interesting thing is you hear that peasants who own more than one, who possess more than one manse, that would be a strip of land that they plow and grow stuff. They own more than one of these strips. They might have different rights and responsibilities because the rights and responsibilities went with the land, not with the person. The land was servile, maybe, or it was free, maybe. Nobody owned land in the Middle Ages, or at least not until about halfway through. It's starting to change about now, meaning story time. And ownership and inheritance of the land is coming into vogue. But even before that, the land could pass from the original peasants to his wife or his children, but it only passed in possession, not in ownership. The Lord didn't own it either. He only had the use of it just like them. And sometimes he would grant fiefs. And sometimes these fiefs could be really weird. For example, Constant Leroux, who was a serf, not a peasant, a serf at an abbey in Anjou, was given a fief consisting of 2 grapevines. That means he had the care and use of the grapevines, and he could sell the increase of those vines after paying rent. The rent consisted of some of the grapes. He made a bundle on that, or at least a sufficient amount, that the abbess then allowed him to take possession of his storehouse, and he pretty much rolled that up and died a wealthy man. Serfs could be wealthy. Think about that. That's not what we normally think of, thinking about serfs. And 2 women, Auberide and Romelda, they sold a house they owned in the town, Market Square. 2 serfs, 2 women serfs, could own a house on their own off the Lord's manor down in the town. They sold that house and used the money proceeds to buy themselves free of the manorial obligations, so they didn't have to do any of the handwork for the Lord. Handdienst, hand service. That meant you had to work on the Lord's land and, sow the crops and harvest them and everything else. Or something else. Sometimes a peasant in the village would have the fief of carrying messages to the next manor. There was no regular postal system. So one of the peasants in the village would put on a cloak with the Lord's arm and take a horse out of the stable and ride to the next manor house and deliver his Lord's message. That's handdienst, hand service. At the time of the story, that is starting to give way to money rent. But up until that time, nobody was paying money for rent. They were paying labor for rent. Okay? They had bylaws. Weisstumer, and the manor would hold courts in which the peasants would put each other on trial for the usual sort of thing, low-class crime. Anything that was a capital offense, the Lord would try in his own court, or even in very serious matters, it would pass on to the royal courts. But here, if a peasant drove his plow a little too far and broke into somebody else's manse, well, that was cause for a suit in the court. The jurors were elected. There was an annual election on Michaelmas, which is the start of the agricultural year, and some of the ones they elected were the jurors. And the requirement for a juror that they had to know everybody and know what kind of person they was, sort of the opposite of what we require, which is that the jurors be ignorant. But the juror would be able to, look at each other and say, okay, you all know Mike there. He's a swell guy. He wouldn't have done this. Or, he's a son of a gun. It's just the sort of thing you would do. Did anybody see him do it? No, you didn't have to see him do it. Oh well. There are some drawbacks to that system. They also elected what were called the Wardens of Autumn, who would organize the harvest, make sure people got out in the fields, gathered the sheaves, and delivered so many sheaves to the Lord as part of their rent. Then there were the rogation days when everybody in the village would walk the bounds of the manor. It's called the Grensgang, going around the borders, so that everybody in the village would know this is how far the Lord's authority goes. You go any further than that, you're on your own. And you better not go any further than that if you're a serf, because you weren't allowed to leave the land if you were a serf. Villagers could. Then they would become freeholders. They would own their own farm somewhere out beyond the Lord's domain. They made sure the kids learned the boundaries, because if the boundary was a creek, they would throw the kid in the creek. If the boundary was a tree, they would bop his head against the tree. It was fun. Everybody had a good time, except maybe the kids. Well, being thrown in the water was probably cool. Banging your head on the tree, not cool. And that's where rogation days came from. Because the priests would go along with it and they would bless the land, bless the harvest, and what have you. Then there was another sort of festival that would come out annually, the Kirchweih, which was the evening before the anniversary of the founding of the church. This was very well established. The next day they'd have a party called a kermis. well enough established that even when I was a kid, they were holding a kermesse at the church that I attended. They stopped doing it after a while because everybody looked at each other and said, "You German?" "No, not really." "Well, we better stop doing it." Besides, it costs too much money. I won a Davy Crockett coonskin cap at one of those affairs. Rock Monday, also in the book. That's when the women in the village would capture the men and hold them for ransom. And just as you might expect, there were some women who found it very easy to capture lots of men, and others would find the men fleeing from her. To get married, you had to pay a fine. In England, that was called merchant or merche. I don't know whether they pronounce it French or not. But a woman could, if she wished, pay the fine on herself for permission to marry at will. When she did that, the men in the village would sort of tremble. Otherwise, you needed the Lord's permission to get married. I think we're almost done. Okay. Yeah, different years. 1347 was it the year 20 of the Emperor Louis, or was it the year 1 of the Emperor Charles? By the way, that's why AD has no year 0. Because if you're counting years from the beginning of the reign, 1347 was the 20th year that Louis was emperor. And then if you watch Game of Thrones, you remember Robert Baratheon? It was sort of like that. He got drunk on a boar hunt, fell off and hit his head. And that was it for Louis. And then Charles was elected. Louis was the Wittelsbach, Charles was a Luxembourger. Oh well, politics. But the same year might be referred to in either way. Also, if you were counting the year of the Lord, they didn't always start at the same time. In some places, the year of the Lord began on March 25th with the Annunciation. In other places, it started on December 25th, the Nativity. Sometimes they even went by the civil calendar and started it on January 1st. So a merchant adventurer traveling through Europe could travel from year to year as easily as from place to place, because the Greek lands used a different system entirely. Okay, I can skip this. This is of no interest to anyone here. But I did want to put this up. Here is the original Society of Catholic Scientists. Some of you guys are pretty important. Robert Grosseteste, for example, developed a scientific method. Observation, theory, confirmation, that whole shtick. So I'm not going to go through the rest of that. My leg is starting to hurt me, and my talking is starting to hurt you. Any questions beside, can we get out of here now?